everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
As I see Potential Motors grow and focus on the off-road space to start with, I certainly think that the learnings that we take from that space is something that, traditional automotive OEMs may not be focusing on as much today, but really consumer demand is driving in that way, especially if we think about, if you picture a world in 10, 15 years where we have autonomous vehicles and we've hit level 5 autonomy, what does the fun side of driving look like? And to me, it's more these off-road type experiences. It's, the whole overlanding phase that is starting to become more and more popular. And
if you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. I'm joined by Sam Poirier, who is the CEO and co-founder of Potential Motors. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me.
So, Sam, when we think about off-road vehicles such as Polaris, that many have heard of, it's fun to drive through the trails, maybe the desert or dunes, or even do one of those kind of rock crawling maneuvers. But these trains put a ton of stress on the drivetrain, the shock absorbers, the chassis, the tires, really the entire vehicle. And really today, much of that is done manually, and it requires a lot of just hands-on behind the wheel experience to maneuver, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about off-road is if you look at the vehicles today, I don't know if you've had the experience of getting to drive any UTVs or ATVs recently, but even the newest ones are pretty akin to what was being developed in the automotive industry 20 years ago, or even further beyond that. So there's really no added functionality in there to be able to help enable the driver to be able to take advantage of the vehicle that they have. And there's a really steep learning curve. So you talked about different suspension components there. So right now, for any form of suspension adjustment, anything like that, somebody has to actually get on their hands and knees, make the changes themselves if they even have that capability. So right now you'd see people who are putting $40,000 into one of these vehicles and then going to a shop, spending another $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 to get it to where they want to be. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for things to change in that space in the coming years.
I think one of the industries that kind of reminds me of something like this is the airline industry. When it comes to kind of larger commercial airlines, the ones that we travel in, they're very well regulated. And of course, the computing and the software and the devices are best in class because of safety reasons. But when you come to much lower class of airplanes, the ones that are done in a more recreational fashion, they're so antiquated. You're literally hoping that you survive this particular flight and make it down. And they're so lagging behind software, hardware, and everything else. And of course, the safety and performance issues. And that's kind of what we're seeing to some extent around off-road. And to your point, it's so labor intensive, so knowledge intensive, and frankly, just costly, right?
Oh, it absolutely is. And it's interesting you bring up the aviation industry because I think in many ways, the automotive industry as a whole, and that leads into off-road as well, has followed the aviation industry from moving away from a more hardware-focused design towards most vehicle or planes today are fly-by-wire and have some sort of software in between, and that's where things with automotive are going as well. So I'd entirely agree. That's kind of where we're at in the off-road today, and as we move to electric, there's a lot of opportunity for that to change.
Well, interestingly enough, we've had a number of VCs on the show before, one of whom have specifically said that they focus on transportation and mobility, but they're particularly bullish around off-road because, especially when it comes to, let's say, a level 4, level 5, you don't have all the hurdles, highway standards and safety standards that a passenger on the road have to have because you're in private land, private grounds, and really you don't have to worry about potentially endangering people. Talk about what is Potential Motors and what exactly is the company doing to help develop intelligent drivetrains that can optimize drivetrain functions based on the terrain and the desired path.
Absolutely. So it's interesting you bring up those regulation specific reasons for looking at off-road from a VC point of view, because that's really what drove us to look at the off-road industry as well. It doesn't mean that you neglect the safety when you're looking at these vehicles, but it just means that there's a lot of opportunity to be able to start bringing these more advanced systems that typically require all of the process of homologation to make it through into the automotive industry. You can start doing them a lot quicker in off-road. So at Potential Motors, really what we're focused on is specifically the drivetrain aspect of the vehicle. So when you look at vehicles that have independent control at the motors for torque vectoring, active or semi-active suspension, and then even steer-by-wire type capabilities within the vehicle, how do we start moving away from systems that have a very distributed setup in terms of control of those aspects to something that's more centralized and really architected from a systems approach. It's like, for example, vehicles today typically have 80 plus different ECUs within the vehicle, or electronic control units, which basically make up the different sub-levels of control for these different actuators. So you could have electronic stability control, ABS, those different pieces within the vehicle, and they can come from multiple different suppliers, which of course works in the sense that you have experts working on each of an individual piece of the system. But it's complicated in the sense that the main OEM in the automotive industry or in the off-road industry has to work with all these different suppliers to build a system that is right for the end customer. So really what we're looking at is, as we move towards a more software-centric approach to that architecture and having less than 80 ECUs in the vehicle, instead of moving towards having 10 or less ECUs that are higher compute power or vehicle control units within the vehicle. How do you start building out the software layers to be able to optimize for these new EV systems where you don't have to have actual hardware ECUs that make up the different components?
Yeah, it's so interesting because for manufacturers, this is just not their competency. I mean, they're really assemblers. They subcontract components from different best-in-class OEMs, and they really assemble it to a final finished product. But then the piece that you're talking about, the vehicle control system, is incredibly complex, and it's really akin to our neurological system in the sense that you have a central brain. But using different forms of touch, sense, smell, whatever it is in terms of sensory, we're able to make cohesive, unified decision. And that's really what they're talking about, is this notion of holistic control, where every hardware is in tune with other hardware and components, and they're communicating, exchanging data, and negotiating maybe, and orchestrating to do something in a cohesive fashion. If you could go into a little bit more depth, I think there are kind of three kind of broad areas that you guys are focusing on. One is the real-time optimization of torque, power, and suspension. The second is the combining the drivetrain functions into that single control system we've been talking about. And then the third, which is the advanced perception of the vehicle's terrain and the environment.
That's right. So I think that's a great analogy that you made between thinking about how humans and animals react, where you have the brain, which is making the high level decisions about how you want to operate in your terrain that you're in, which is making decisions based off of what you're seeing. It's inertial navigation, which is happening in your head at the same time, and then actually controlling all these actuators, which are your muscles, to be able to get around. So that's the approach that we're taking towards this future of control systems within vehicles. And the first part or I guess the last part you touched on, but really the first part that I'll touch on, is on the perception side of things. So rather than just having a purely reactive system, which is really the way that most vehicles, especially in the off-road industry today, are built, even if they have that system, it's moving towards a more predictive or proactive way of approaching that control system. So that means using sensors on the vehicle to actually look in front of the vehicle to identify what are the changes in elevation in the terrain? How are we going up and down? But then also, what are the changes in friction? So actually estimating in front of the vehicle, what type of grip you're going to have as you move through that. So that's kind of the first piece of understanding what is the terrain that you're actually driving through, which of course in off-road terrain is extremely important. And then the second piece is bringing that into the control system to actually be able to make optimization based off of where you're going and what's currently happening to the vehicle. So now you have the piece that's happening in front of the vehicle that you can predict what are going to be the interaction between your vehicle and that terrain. You combine that with what's actually happening to the vehicle at that time and start to look at how you can optimize, control torque at the wheels, suspension actuation, steering, basically the whole vehicle dynamics in a way that you're able to augment the way that the vehicle or the user is interacting with that vehicle to give better efficiency, but also improved performance in a way that is reducing the overall complexity of implementing that software layer there.
I'm curious because this notion of prediction can be defined as something maybe like directly in front, maybe less than a few feet, or it could be something where it's really analyzing satellite imagery, topography, maybe several kilometers out, and really kind of planning the course, so to speak, for optimization. What are we saying when you say advanced perception?
So for us, we look at a bit of both of those. The challenge with the off-road terrain, of course, is that a lot of these areas are remote. So relying on GPS and INSS can be a little bit more complicated in that regard. Or GNSS, sorry, can be a little bit more complicated in that regard or less reliable. So basically what we're mainly relying on is the inertial navigation system of the vehicle, but then also using a mix of cameras and radar to be able to actually look in front of the vehicle. So this is in the first, 20, 30 feet in front of the vehicle to make very quick real-time decisions on what's happening versus, kilometers out from the vehicle.
So is the system in effect creating almost like a 3D vector of that 20, 30 feet out and understanding that situational awareness and being able to kind of recreate almost like a digital twin, let's say, so that it understands, this peak, this slope, this terrain, and being able to then instruct the rest of the sensors and actuators to do its part.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. Basically the goal is that we can simulate the environment that we're driving through before actually having the vehicle drive through that. And that's where you can start to really take advantage of, what you can do with these advanced electric drive systems where you have, really specific control at each wheel of the vehicle.
One of the advances that we're starting to see around robotics is actually not physical robotics doing its thing, but actually doing a lot of modeling and improvements and optimization in a virtual sense. So you got, MIT and others that's working on these polygamous robots that are moving around different objects and courses and navigating, and the lessons learned is then gets, essentially downloaded into the actual physical robots that now have new capabilities to actually traverse difficult terrains. So similarly, how are you guys training these models, both using synthetic data as well as real data, to cover some of these common as well as edge cases?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of improvement over the years on the simulation side of things for specifically these applications. A lot of it coming from robotics, but then also from the autonomous vehicle side of things, where there's had to be a lot of push to be able to increase the amount of data that we're getting, not just from real vehicles, but also doing it in these simulated environments. So yeah, we've been leveraging that pretty heavily and actually working on our own simulations specific for off-road, because that's one of the challenges with that space is that, in the off-road, you're not just looking at the, flat physics that can be associated with on-road paved terrain, but you're looking at terrain that is, soft in areas. It can have, like, if you think of a dirt road or a muddy road, you have not just like a hard layer on top, but you may have a hard layer on top that the camera is able to identify, but then there might actually be a soft layer underneath where you can have some sort of, slip that can occur. So that's where things become really interesting from a simulation perspective, because it's trying to understand, how far or how much do you need to model in this terrain or in this environment where, it's computationally effective, but it's also actually useful for you in the problem that you're trying to solve. So, we've been using a lot of, mixed reality, where we're taking information from actual vehicles to, map a terrain based off of driving through it, but then using that in simulation to be able to run through it multiple times and test various different things.
Yeah, it's super interesting, really is. And my head where it's going is already different levels of subscription. So you have average capability that basically can traverse through most terrains, but if you want to specifically drive in a sub-Saharan desert, or in the Siberian region, or the Arctic region, or someplace that's kind of both water and land, for instance, that they can actually upgrade to these new capabilities. But it really starts to cover a lot of different edge cases. That's kind of the potential derivatives is quite almost endless.
It absolutely is. And that's why, I think that's why I get so excited about working in the off-road space in general, because it crosses all of the what you consider edge cases in on-road driving, which, if you look at where autonomous vehicles are going and the challenges that we're going to have to face with getting to full level 5 autonomy, it's in those conditions that are typically considered those edge cases where you have, poor weather conditions, you're driving in conditions that are, not typical to your paved road. And that's some of the stuff that, you're facing every single day in the off-road, which is obviously a massive challenge to be working on. But that's why I think it's interesting to start now and see how that can apply in the future to the automotive industry as well.
Well, again, just the way my mind works, because we also cover space, naturally, I'm thinking potential motors not only has applicability for terrestrial, but also on the moon, as well as on Mars and deeper space, because when we talk about terrains that's lesser known and being able to dynamically adapt, there's nothing better than the example of rovers. Of course, we have helicopters, and that's relatively new. But for the most part, these rovers are vehicles that have mobility, but have to go through very difficult terrains. And because we haven't had enough data to know exactly what's really out there, let's say, for example, Mars, you need something that can really adapt and be able to, get out of things situationally that would otherwise be difficult and technically just almost nearly impossible otherwise. So I wonder if potential motors has aspirations to intersect with rovers at some point.
I certainly think that there's a lot of opportunity there because, like you said, the technical building blocks that really we need to face through what we're doing, focusing on the the control side of thing at the drivetrain level is, it's very similar. And if I think about where electric vehicles can go in the long term, and you think about what that drivetrain looks like, where you have, 4 independent motors and you do have fully active suspension and steer by wire, and a lot of these things that exist today on these rovers, that's really where opportunity starts to open up. And I don't know, I'm also a space nerd, so I certainly would love to pull the company in that direction at some point.
Well, I'm not sure exactly to what extent I can share online, but one of our portfolio startups does cover space, and they're working on some very exciting things on the moon that has a direct intersection with what you're doing. Let's talk about potential motors. I think it's one of those things where clearly the value add is huge. If you're clearly in the off-road world, whether for utility and just kind of leisure purposes, or for construction and tractors and whatnot, the value that you're providing is huge. And of course, we haven't even talked about maintenance and downside. So in other words, by preemptively being able to go through some of these more difficult places in a way where you minimize the potential damage and costs, that's a huge cost savings for some of these operators and manufacturers, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the downtime that occurs with the off-road vehicles in general is really significant. On the recreational side, which is where we talk with a lot of people who just have experience with these vehicles, the amount that you have simple mechanical problems like CV axles breaking. In existing systems, you have belts that break, you have failures in tie rods and suspension and steering components. All of these things that really, if you had a form of software layer in between that was, not taking away from the driver's ability to control the vehicle, but really augmenting the way that they're interacting with it, you can solve a lot of these problems pretty quickly just by realizing that you're going beyond the torque threshold of what some of these components are able to withstand. And then to the second point that you brought up, it's the predictive maintenance side of things, and actually thinking over the long term how these components are affected by the driving that you're doing.
Well, I think it's a great strategy to have this kind of a white space you want to be able to essentially monopolize to a great extent. But I'm also thinking in terms of the larger market is that as the EV, but more the autonomous vehicle market starts to mature eventually to level 4 and level 5 down the road, is that a lot of those companies and software companies that are supporting those aspects are going to be more keen to supporting kind of the common case on the road. So I wonder if potential motors can come in and augment that so that if I have the Cybertruck, for example, not only can I confidently go on the road, but if for some reason I had to deviate from the regular road, that the software can support the capability for that off-roading.
Absolutely. Well, we actually spent a lot of time talking with OEMs in the automotive space at the beginning of the company, really to understand, where is the industry going from their perspective, and what are the challenges that they're trying to overcome immediately, but in the long term. And some of the biggest things in the long term that they're trying to work towards is moving away from this very distributed architecture that they have in these vehicles to more centralized. And what we're talking about having a more software focused design approach to these vehicles. So as I see potential motors grow and focus on the off-road space to start with, I certainly think that the learnings that we take from that space is something that, traditional automotive OEMs may not be focusing on as much today, but really consumer demand is driving in that way, especially if we think about, if you picture a world in 10, 15 years where we have autonomous vehicles and we've hit level 5 autonomy, what does the fun side of driving look like? And to me, it's more these off-road type experiences. It's, the whole overlanding phase that is starting to become more and more popular in the Southwest. And I think that, the direction that we're going in has a lot of application to automotive in the future.
And pragmatically speaking, and I'm in the East Coast in the New York tri-state area, is we've been hit by so many things, everything from high heat to floods and hurricanes. And there's been so many cases where we've had to literally go off-road because there's a tree that's down and stopping the stream. We have to literally go to a grass or semi-forest just to kind of, make a UE, so to speak. So in some sense, more of us are going to be exposed to inclement weather, and the externalities of that means that we may be forced to go off-road. So, these capabilities are not just nice to have. In some cases, it's going to be a matter of survival. Now, I want to talk about something that's kind of interesting is that Potential Motors, the founding of this company wasn't based out of, let's say, Detroit or Silicon Valley or someplace in Texas where you have some of these kind of hubs. Rather, it came out of a small town in Canada. And I wonder how you guys were able to get that up and going and still be able to attract the kind of capital and attention to where you guys are today.
Yeah, I think, so we're based in Fredericton, New Brunswick, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's just east of Quebec and Montreal. So certainly not a tech hub. I mean, there's certainly, we have our own group of startups here, but not the same as Silicon Valley or Texas or any of these places that you mentioned. So we've had, I think, very different starting process than what some other companies might have had. But, the benefit is that in a smaller place like this, it's very tight knit, all of the people who are working on these challenging problems. And, university, for example, is a great place for anything like this to start. But then there's also existing founders who have been through the process in this space, who have gone from, in a place like Fredericton, for example, but also in areas around Atlantic Canada, gone from starting, a very basic software company to, taking on Silicon Valley and actually, eventually, some of our advisors have been through the process selling their companies to IBM and Salesforce. So, what's really helped us is the fact that, although this is a small area, it's small in the sense that you get to talk to everyone and everyone is willing to help. So, we've had incredible advisors who have been through the process of starting companies. They're able to make, great introductions to be able to get started. And then, honestly, as much of a negative impact as it's been with COVID, it's also helped us to make connections. For example, the German auto industry is very, face-to-face, be in person, but that completely changed as soon as COVID hit. So all of a sudden, conversations that I highly doubt we would have been able to have, 3-4 years ago. We started having those phone calls and those, Zoom conversations, which, allowed us to be able to start building the network and team that's necessary to be able to, attract the funding that we needed to take this on.
Amazing. Well, we only have time for one more question, which is lessons learned. So as someone who has really hands-on experience and also the vision for this company, can you share any product or project failure and the lessons learned from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, funny enough, when myself and my co-founders started the company, we originally were actually working on converting vehicles to electric. So very, different product path than we have today. And, we had, I'd say, pretty good technical success on that process in building out basically a set of components for replacing an engine in a vehicle, and getting to the point where we had prototypes that were working and companies that were interested in getting involved. But I think the aspect that we failed on was looking at the ultimate value that we'd be providing to customers in the long term. And if we look at the bigger picture, the automotive industry and I guess the vehicle industry as a whole, that's something that we didn't necessarily focus on as much as we needed to at that time. So it ultimately led to us, having to, relook at the fundamental business case that we had and what are the bigger picture problems that the industry is facing, which ultimately led us to what we're working on today and, facing this product niche that we have in the off-road and focusing on specifically the controls problem. But, I think the lesson learned from that is that, the world that we live in today, it's very easy to get on a call with just about anyone if you, put the time in and are able to work to make the connections. So take advantage of that and certainly talk to people who are able to, help you understand really the value that your business case is going to bring to these businesses in the long term.
Absolutely. And with that, I have been joined by Sam Poirier, who is the CEO and co-founder of Potential Motors. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.